Hi everyone. This is a lesson on the main types of bone cells found in bone tissue, as well as a review of what you should typically find in connective tissue regarding bones. Okay, so this is what we're going to cover. We're going to cover a little bit of histology, as in the structure of the tissue, and then we'll specifically go into the function, the roles of the various types of bone cells. These are the vocabulary words that we're going to go over as well in how they relate to the physiology, meaning the job of those bone cells. Okay, so you should write down histology of osseous tissue. Osseous, if you recall, is just a fancy way of saying bone tissue. Now, recall osseous is a type of connective tissue, and I really encourage you to write this flow chart down to help you remember what are the elements of connective tissue. So, unlike the other four types of tissue, nervous, epithelial, connective, and muscular, unlike the other three, connective tissue is the stuff that isn't cells is almost as important as the cells themselves. In fact, arguably more important in some ways. Compare that to the other three tissue types, and those tissues, muscular, epithelial, and nervous, are just mainly made of cells. But for connective, it can be equal parts or even more matrix than cell in those tissue. Matrix is the non-cellular stuff laid around the outside of the cell. And generally speaking, in connective tissue, the cells are what produces and then maintains the matrix. And in bone tissue, the matrix, the stuff that's not cells that's really critical, are fibers and ground substance. The fibers in the matrix of bone is collagen. Collagen provides flexibility and strength in living bone. If you take a raw chicken bone and try to bend it, it's going to be really tough to bend. That's because the collagen retains kind of a gluiness, a gluey clinginess that prevents the bone from cracking. However, dead bones, as you might have seen in movies and stuff like that, you kind of associate them with rocks. Like if you crack them, if you slam off the side, the bone may crack in half. It may be very chalky. And that's a result of the mineral salts. So the mineral salts is the calcium chalkiness that's on the bones. In dead bones, what happens is because there's no longer cells, living cells, to produce the collagen in dead bones, all that's left behind are the mineral salts. But the mineral salts is 2/3 of the matrix and a huge component of the bone. And the calcium and mineral deposits that are left behind are what remains far beyond the lifespan of that organism. So what ends up happening is when we study bones in class, and if you get a chance to touch skeletal bones in class, what you're actually touching is the mineral imprint of where all the living bone was. You're just touching the mineral ground substance that's left behind. But everything else, the collagen, the cells, those are gone. So when the bone is alive, though, what's helping to actively produce those mineral deposits, what's helping to actively produce that strong collagen that's keeping the bone really tough while you're living, are bone cells. And these four main cells are the critical cells that help grow and remodel, meaning break down and rebuild the bone constantly through one's lifetime. So there are osteoprogenitor cells, also known as osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. This one, the osteoprogenitor cells, are given a ton of weird names. Sometimes it's called bone stem cells. Sometimes it's called pre-osteoblast, and we'll get into why it's called those things in a little bit. Okay, so let's go over the jobs of these actual bone cells, these four main bone cells. And I kind of like to put them into two main groups. So the osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteocytes, those are all about keeping the bone alive and strong. The osteoclasts, on the other hand, their job is about breaking down bone, which seems weird, but actually, as we're going to learn throughout the other lectures and stuff, if you want to build a bone, you sometimes have to sand the edges a little bit. Sort of like if you want to put something up on a wall, you have to kind of clean the wall a little bit, and the osteoclasts do that. In addition to that, sometimes you need the stuff stored in your bones more than you need the bone themselves, the calcium. So the osteoclasts are also really critical for that. So bone destroying stuff is almost as important as the bone forming stuff when it comes to and possibly even more important when it comes to running your body and keeping it alive. Okay, so this is kind of how you classify these 4 types of bone cells. So this picture you don't actually need to draw down, but it kind of gives you an idea. So remember, we have our 2 categories: the bone maintaining building group and the group that breaks down cells, and specifically the bone tissue. And actually what ends up happening is pre-osteoblast is, again, another name for osteogenic. It's got a lot of weird names. And what that is just a stem cell that doesn't quite do its job, but it's sitting there ready to turn into an osteoblast at any time, and an osteocyte. So notice all the bone building cells are all related to one another and come from each other. The osteoclast cell, though, actually is not really related to that group, and it's actually more related to monocytes or macrophages, also known as white blood cells. And if you remember the job of white blood cells, they're to go around the body and chomp down on organisms and other cells. So this destroying aspect is similar to the destroying aspect of osteoclasts and their ability to chomp down on bones. All right, so let's go to individual function of those 4 main cell categories. So we have osteoprogenitor cells. So osteoprogenitor cells, also known as osteogenic and sometimes known as pre-osteoblast, because it's before the osteoblast, I'll turn into osteoblast. They're just precursors of the osteoblast. You're going to find these cells generally anywhere that has the potential to build up more bone. So if you remember the long bone grows at the epiphyseal plate and also grows along the membrane. So the endosteum, the periosteum, all of those sections of any bone is capable of growing and getting thicker or getting thinner. So you're going to find osteoprogenitor cells, the cells that have the potential to become and form bone, in those areas that have the potential for growth. Osteoblasts are the actual cells that form bone. Okay? So this is sort of the image over here of the osteoprogenitor cells. So then what happens is it develops into an osteoblast. Now, this osteoblast is a lot fluffier than the osteoprogenitor cells. And the reason why that is because it's got a lot more organelles now to help start making lots and lots of proteins, specifically the proteins that are going to form the matrix. Those collagen fibers, the ability to, and proteins that will help stick minerals to those collagen fibers, that's being actively formed and dumped on the outside of the osteoblast to help create bone. This process of forming bone is called bone deposition. So because you're depositing bone, you're laying down bone. Okay? And when you're laying down bone, you're also going to lay down calcium. And so that's going to actually take out calcium from your blood and store it in your bones. So we're creating the collagen and we're doing what's called calcification, which means dumping in calcium to harden up the bone. Finally, when you have that bone formed, the osteoblast is no longer able to move around. I'll draw a picture of that later on. And then it becomes what we call an osteocyte. So it's still the same cell. So this one cell went from an osteogenic cell, then created lots of bone as an osteoblast, and then when it created enough bone around itself, then it did its job, and now it's just going to sit there and maintain what it built by becoming an osteocyte. The osteocyte is just the mature cell that's keeping that bone up. So I'm going to draw a little bit of a cartoon version of what's happening, at least at the osteoblast level. So we have our osteoblast here. Okay? And what it's doing is, with its fluffy cell, it's going to be laying out collagen around itself, a collagen network. And then within this collagen network, it's going to help produce proteins. They're going to help stiffen up the collagen network around itself. And fairly soon, now imagine you're a builder, and the way you build is you just dump cement around your body and you don't leave that pocket. So, as a result, this cell is now cemented in and it can no longer move. And now it can't really grow more bone, but it can keep the cement up, especially if the cement is degrading, and that's why we call it an osteocyte at the point where it's dumped a ton of bone around itself, and it's just keeping it up but not making more bone. All right, our final bone type is called osteoclasts. So these are huge multinucleated, meaning that it has many nuclei, just like white blood cells. Nuclei is just another word for the plural for nucleus. So there's many nucleuses within this one cell. And those nuclei allow it to hunt and digest things. And in this case, it's going to be able to hunt around and chomp down on bone. So I like to say the C is for chomping. Okay? So in this case, it has a lot of what we call lysosomal enzymes. So if you recall, the lysosome is the organelle that helps the cell digest stuff and destroy things. So it's got lots and lots of lysosomes inside of it and they're like tiny stomachs that basically anything the cell swallows or touches, it has a capability of breaking it down because of all that stuff. And those acids and enzymes allow it to break down the protein collagens and release the mineral. When that mineral is released, it's allowed to diffuse into the bloodstream. So this whole process is called bone resorption, meaning you're taking the bone and you're kind of reabsorbing it into elsewhere, in this case, into your blood. And then when it gets into your blood, that calcium can be delivered to other organs that need the calcium. Generally speaking, your nerves and your muscles use a lot of calcium. You also need this process to be done if you want to grow, maintain, or repair your bone. Your bone is going to wear away and get crappy over time, the one that's built. Sort of like in your house, eventually the walls get dirty and gross and have little pits and stuff in them. And over time, you're going to want to replace it. So you're going to use the osteoclast to strip down the old crappy bone so you can lay down nice, clean, new bone that's nice and stronger right over it. So osteoclast, yes, it breaks down bone, but if you want your bones to stay strong, you actually need osteoclast activity to regularly renew the bone so it's good and as fresh as possible. So, kind of a quick recap in terms of pictures. In general, right? If you want to build bone, you're gonna create into osteoblasts and then start forming bone around it. But if you have bone that already exists, what you're gonna need to do is mow it down with the osteoclasts and then have your osteoblasts start to form bone and then form into osteocytes to maintain the bone it does form. So this is just a quick recap of the jobs of each of these guys. We have our osteoprogenitor cells, which will turn into our osteoblasts, which are going to lay down matrix around each of those cells until they're stuck within their matrix and they become osteocytes. But once that bone starts to get crappy, we want those osteoclasts to mow down the crappy bone that's there. And this is just another image of what those bone cells may do, except there's all these like hormones and regulatory molecules in the picture, but don't worry about that. Just kind of focus on what the osteocyte kind of looks like from the osteoblasts, as well as the osteoclasts chewing down stuff. So, when you build, you need to break down a little bit, all right? And in addition to that, you'll notice that when we build bone, we're adding calcium to the bones, and when we break down bone, we're removing calcium from the bones and being able to now use that calcium that we released. So our bone cells are actually interacting with each other. Now, a big reason why that is because blood calcium level is really important to your body's function, because blood calcium is needed to help your brain work. If your brain doesn't work, you're dead. So at the end of the day, weaker bones will be what we choose over our, not working brain. Okay? But at the same time, blood calcium needs to be the right amount because if it's too high, you actually get heart damage and brain damage. So you want to keep the right levels. So as a result, we're going to kind of constantly bounce back and forth between whether we build our bones or break down our bones in order to maintain the right level of calcium. So our bones are the storage area. Every time we have too much, we make bone. Every time we don't have enough calcium, we break down bone. So this is kind of the overall thing. So if our blood calcium level is too low, we break down our bone with osteoclasts. If blood calcium level is too high, then we're going to block off our osteoclasts, meaning prevent our bone from being broken down, and instead promote, meaning make more of and activate our bone building cells, our osteoblasts, so we can put calcium or keep it in our bones. So these are links to these videos for osteoblast and osteoclast activity that will help you visualize it. Depending on what app you're using, I'll try to put a direct link to these videos in whatever app you're using, EduCreations or YouTube, so you can access these videos if you want to watch them to visualize their activity. Bone remodeling is another type of way osteoblasts and osteoclasts work, and if you go into it, it'll be detailed in a later lecture. So, there are more advanced lectures that go over how bone is made, but generally speaking, when we're building bone, it's always thanks to the activity of osteoblasts. So this is just the general rule for how the cells actually work when we're building bone. All right? So first we're going to have our stem cell turn into osteoblasts. Our osteoblasts dump matrix fibers and minerals around itself, and then they calcify, meaning harden. And when that matrix hardens, our osteoblasts become trapped, which is why you have lacunae. So if you recall the lecture on the structure of compact bone and how compact bone have pockets that the osteocytes sit inside of, and the reason why those pockets exist is just because of the way bone is being built, where the cell is actually dumping cement around itself, that cement mineral, and inherently creating its own pocket where it's stuck inside. Finally, when it creates that pocket, it becomes and that's around it, so it can no longer make more bone, and its only option is to just maintain the bone. It becomes an osteocyte. And the osteocyte will remain there until you either die or want to remodel the bone, as in renew the bone and clean it up. And in this case, that's when osteoclasts will come in and they'll help clean away old crappy bone, or just strip it for whatever other reason it may need, or you may also have just bone loss due to some kind of injury. All right, so our key takeaways is just a reminder that bone tissue is connective tissue, and that matrix is hypercritical, and that matrix is kept very strong due to the collagen, and it doesn't break because of collagen, or it's hard to break because of collagen. However, the mineral deposits make it hard, meaning calcium and phosphorus. And when you die, those mineral deposits are what are left behind in your skeleton, is what we touch when we touch a dead skeleton bone. A quick summary of the cell types: our osteoprogenitor cells are the precursors to osteoblasts. The osteoblasts, B for build our bone. Our osteoclasts break down or chew down our bone. And osteocyte maintains the bone. The word site means mature cell. So osteo means bone. So chondrocyte, chondro means cartilage, and cyte just means mature cell. And if you see the word blast, that means forming stuff. So if you remember, fibroblasts are important to help form connective tissue, collagen. So osteoblasts and fibroblasts are similar in terms of function. And just remembering, blood calcium level is really critical to the function of your body. So you're going to use osteoclasts and osteoblasts to maintain that correct level of calcium in your blood, and just storing or taking it away from your bones as needed. And finally, this goes over sort of the progression and how bone is developed. We make our osteoblasts make bone. Then when they get stuck inside of it, they become osteocyte, and they have no other option other to maintain it. And you're gonna make more bone when there's space for it, and that will happen if you have osteoclast activity to help clean up the edges so that there's space to lay down new bone. All right, that concludes the lesson. Move on to any other work you have.